All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture class for web and mobile systems for winter 2023 semester. In today's lecture, we are going to be continuing where we had left off with our discussions in the last class, which was we were working on this demo portfolio website project, which was basically structured using HTML5, right? So to quickly give you a recap, we had designed about 5 different pages, which can be a part of the portfolio website aspect. So we had a page, a landing page. We had a page for the resume, some page for displaying our projects that we have done, and then your hobbies, and then the contact me project, okay, page, sorry. And we had learned about different HTML aspects while we were performing these different tasks. So some of these aspects that we had learned in the last class was basically to work on, to first learn what are the 2 different categories of HTML tag. So we learned that there was something called a block tag versus an inline tag, okay? Where if you use a block tag, the feature essentially means that a new line will be inserted before and after when that tag is rendered on the browser. So an example of block tag that we looked into is basically the header, which was the H1 tag. So if you put the header, then by default, below and above, a new line will be inserted, right? We learned about that. We also learned some of the basic tags, like how to put a heading, how to put a paragraph, how to create divisions in our web pages, how to insert lists, unordered and ordered lists, and how to use the anchor tag, which essentially helps us to embed references in our website, right? So these references can be internal. For example, you are basically trying to create a nav bar wherein you connect all the different menu options with the list items that you have created, or it can be absolute, or sometimes also known as external, wherein you can put a link to a different page which you don't own as a resource, and then you can basically, your users can traverse from your page to another page using that absolute hyperreference link that we have, right? We also learned about how to insert image files. Okay, we learned about the img tag, which essentially allows us to embed an image onto your HTML page. All right. So continuing down that discussion, this was essentially our project setup that we were working on. So this root directory here. So I have added 2 more subdirectories to this directory, which is basically one for audio files and one for video files, because we are going to be learning or seeing how we can embed not just images, but other multimedia files such as audio and video to our website as well, okay? In the root directory, always remember that our index.html will be the landing file, so always declare it as such. And then whatever the rest of your project setup is, make sure that they are neatly organized into its corresponding folders, and the content of that folders should basically reflect whatever content that you're trying to embed on your website, okay? So what we want to do is carry on with our project. So this is basically running on live server right now, is the same 5500 port number. And we will just try to embed a few more HTML elements on our web page, and slowly learn about a few more tags that are more frequently used in our day-to-day operations when it comes to developing with HTML, okay? So the resume page is over, project page, and then hobbies page. So let's do the hobbies page first, where we can essentially take care of embedding a little bit more of multimedia images and stuff like that. So first of all, I will show you 2 things. So the first thing is to basically how to embed your own audio and video files, and then to show how you can embed a in-display video file or something like that from YouTube and stuff like that, and into your own website, right? So basically, instead of having to visit the youtube.com platform, how other users can essentially view any media file on your website itself without having the need to go to the other platform. Okay, so to do so, essentially what we need to know. So the first task that we are going to do is how to embed audio files and video files. Okay, so remember before 2016 or so, essentially, if you had to play any audio or video on your website, it required a third-party plugin. Essentially, that plugin was known as, well, the popular plugin was essentially Flash Player. There were other plugins and stuff like that, but that created an issue that depending on what type of plugin the developer were using, the users would have to kind of ensure that their browsers had that same plugin installed as well, right? And this is a problem because you cannot package the plugin when you are basically dispensing the service through a website, right? You cannot essentially put that into a same project, okay? So that creates a problem because not every user might have all the different types of plugins that was available for playing audio and video files, right? So what was done is that the concept of using third-party plugins was then retired, and then HTML developed its own tags that can be essentially used in order to embed audio and video files on the page, right? So what I'm doing here before I even start, embedding the audio and video files, my audio folder essentially has an MP3 file as an extension. So I'm going to embed that into my projects page. So let me open that page first. So I'm going to use this here. Okay. And similarly, I have a video folder, which has two different examples depending on the resolution. So one is a 1280 pixel and the other one is a 1920 pixel, depending on the screen size. It's just two different, but you can use just one. And it has an extension. So of course, there are different extensions that you can embed. I'm using the .mov or the movie file. You can also use .mp4 and stuff like that, okay? So these are the resources that you own, right? So we are mimicking the behavior when you have your own audio and video files to essentially embed onto your page itself, right? So in order to do that, so we have the header and the footer. So we are going to, right between the header and the footer, create a tag here, and let's call it main, okay? And here we can give it an ID. Let me just remove my type pad. Okay, and we can call this project page body, project page body, something like this, right? And within this main, let us create two different sections. Okay, you can choose to create divisions as well if you would like to, but we know that section is a semantic tag, which essentially conveys the fact that all of the content that will be present within that section are correlated. So what we want to do is essentially create two sections, one for our audio file and one for video files. Okay, so the first section, so let us go ahead and create these two sections then. So this is the section one, and then a little bit lower, we will create another section, section two. So let's give it some class values. So we can say here multimedia, and then let's give it an ID to uniquely distinguish it from the next section. So we can call this audio section. Okay, and then here we can do the same thing, but we will change the ID. Okay. So we will still have a grouping for multimedia, but we will have different IDs that can help us to basically distinguish between the audio and the video sections. All right. So once that is done, the next thing essentially is to embed the audio and video files. All right. So if you are using the audio and video tag, it's pretty straightforward. It has the tag name, and then it requires an attribute in order to express the source where you are bringing the audio or video file from, given that it is present in your project directory. Okay. Of course, if you're trying to embed something from somewhere else, you have to use the absolute link, wherein you have to specify the HTTPS link for that file, right? So let's say, for example, here, we want to put this video file, which is present inside the video subdirectory in our root folder, right? So for that, I will use the video tag. Okay, and then within the video tag, I have to give a source attribute. Okay, and essentially the source attribute, the src attribute, as we saw when we were working with our image file here. So somewhere we were working with our image file. So just like the image file requires a source attribute in order to point out where your actual resource is, the project, the video and the audio file also requires those source files, right? So here, where is our video file present? It is essentially present inside the root directory. So if we close these things, we can see it is present in the root directory inside the folder called videos. And then this is basically the name of the file, right? So we are going to follow that same path name structure. So inside the root directory, that is /, sorry, not inside the root directory. So we are currently within the pages subdirectory. So we have to come out one level up so that we can access all the contents of the root directory. Then we have to go into the folder for videos. And now it can link to one of the two files. So let me choose the first file. It does not make much of a difference, right? So when you're embedding videos, one thing to keep in mind is the supported extensions for this HTML tag, right? What kind of different source files that you can incorporate. So you need to remember that you can do .avi. You also have the option for the one that we're doing right now, .mov, and then you can also do .mp4. There are options for .webm as well. This is also a smaller format and things like this, right? There are 2 or 3 more, but I don't remember that from the top of my head, so you can check it out. But these are some of the well-known ones that you can essentially use, all right? And once that is done, within the video, you can essentially kind of specify any kind of text that you want to embed here. So what you can say here, a sample of a video file and stuff like that, right? So this is one of the options that you can do. And sometimes this is going to take up a lot of the space that you can essentially have. So this will just show up, but some of important things are missing here, right? And you can do the same thing for the audio, and the audio will show up. But what is it that you notice is kind of missing here? Any suggestion?
Like a play button or a video.
Right. So essentially what we call that as is basically controls. Okay, so we don't, when you see a video, let's say on YouTube or stuff like that, you see the controls button here, which is play, pause, which is the same button. And then you have essentially what do you call it? A track seek, a loading bar or something like that, that shows you the extent of music or video that has been played and stuff like that, right? So there are a few controls, which are of course optional, as you saw, because without it, it will still work, but kind of aids the process of accessibility when you're working with it, right? So first and foremost, let's work on all of those different attributes that you can work with, right? So one of the attributes that helps you control the size is the width. So just like we learned in our images, where you can specify width and height, the same goes for other multimedia aspects as well, right? So here I can specify a width, and let's say I can call it 20% of the window size, right? So if you do something like this, this kind of reduces. Let's keep it at like 35, so it's still big enough for us, right? And the next attribute that will allow you to essentially see the controls that we are kind of used to seeing, we just have to use this Boolean attribute called controls, right? So as long as it is specified, it indicates that it is present, right? So if you just do this, and this will go to the next stuff. So if you just do the controls, now you can see that here we have the images, and then you can play, pause, move this bar around, control the volumes, go to full screen mode and stuff like that. So that's all you need, right? You also have the option to allow for autoplay. Generally, it is not suggested for autoplay, because what happens is if you keep a multimedia file on autoplay, then the moment your website loads on the client side, then it's going to start playing, and that might have some bandwidth issues and stuff like that. So, but just as a good to know factor, if you want to have autoplay as well, then essentially that's also a Boolean attribute. You don't have to specify a value. As long as you specify it, it indicates the fact that it is true, right? And then if you want the video or the audio file to keep on looping once it has finished, right, and infinitely continue to go on and on until you stop it, then essentially the Boolean attribute for that is loop, right? So this is like the full set of different supporting attributes that you can have for a video file. And please remember that this attribute also holds true for audio files as well, right? So at this point, what you can do is basically you can pause the video and then try the same thing for your video file, for your audio file as well, and see if you can do the same thing, right? So take a shot at it, pause the video, and then you can figure out how to do that. Okay. All right. So to do the audio file, the same thing will be utilized. So I think I had created an audio section somewhere. Where is it? Here. Okay. So here I can say my audio tag. So the tag that we use is basically audio, just like we did. We absolutely need an src tag in order to specify where my audio file is. So remember, given currently where I am or where this page is, I have to go one step up, go into my audio folder, and then link it to the file that we are working with, right? And then similarly, we need to give it controls. As long as we do controls, that kind of take care of the major stuff that is present here, right? And here you can say a sample of audio file on this page. All right. So if you see here, we have the audio file here. Okay, and that will play some music and stuff like that. And similarly, we have the video files. All right. As far as the position is concerned, with respect to where you want to put it on the page, right? Center it out or put it on the right, or kind of anchor it to a particular position on the website. That is something that is controlled by CSS itself. Okay, so something that you have to keep in mind. So another question is, sometimes you would want to start the video or kind of indicate, what do you call it? Like to show the user that you want to see the video from this particular timestamp, right? So basically, when you load the website itself, instead of starting it from 00 timestamp, you would want to start it from a particular timestamp. Let's say this audio file, I want to start it from 30 seconds instead of 00 seconds and stuff like that. So if I want to do that, and anything we do for one of these applies to the other as well, something to keep in mind is when you specify this source here for your audio or video files, what you can do is you have the capability to put a hashtag after that, and then using this factor T and then equals to, and if you say the timestamp itself, let's say 30 seconds, then this will allow you to essentially, you can see here that the bar has loaded to the 30-second point itself, right? So if there is an important part of the video, right? Or sometimes you see when you search for, let's say, some kind of DIY situation, right? You're searching how to do something like fix something or build something, let's say. And then sometimes you Google it, and then Google shows you a YouTube video which only focuses on the timestamps where you are essentially trying to, or that is relevant to you, right? So when they do that, this is the the solution that they use in order to ensure that you can exactly start watching your stuff from there. Okay. The other options. So any questions here? Is this part clear? All good. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, this is clear.
Okay. So the next thing that we would like to know is basically how to embed something which is not a part of your own project directory. That is, here we saw the example where essentially we have files, video files and audio files, and we can essentially embed that onto our web page, right? But what if the situation arises where, let's say, you want to share another website's or web page's video. It could be video, it could be the website itself on your page. Okay. Without having to without visiting the other website platform. Right. So this is basically the motivation that we are trying to essentially implement here. Right. So that's the whole idea. So let me go and see if I can find a YouTube video that we can essentially use here. So I'll go here and I will say some movie trailer. So let's say Top Gun Maverick trailer. Okay. So essentially now what I want to do is I need to share this video, embed this, and then copy this. Right. So if you want to do that, things are pretty straightforward from YouTube itself. Right. So here, let me just first create another section right below this. All right. And this section is basically about a tutorial on how to use the HTML tag that is called iframe. So iframe allows you to have this plain page section and stuff like that. So what you want to do is basically paste this and save this. I just copied this from YouTube right now. All right. So what this is saying, this is the tag itself. Okay. There's no content inside this tag. If you want to write something, you can write something. This source is coming directly from YouTube. I just copied this right now from YouTube. So if you open up any of your YouTube videos, and then if you look at the share button, and the option, the first option that you will get is called embed. So if you click on that embed, then YouTube will generate the code, right? So what you need to pay attention to here is, of course, the width and the height is something that is just aesthetically controlling what is being displayed on the page, right? So if we go here, we can see that this is what you are looking at. This is the output that you need to look at, right? SRC file is mandatory. And here you can see that this is an absolute link, right? So whenever we say that we are using a link, which is HTTPS in nature, we are essentially using the absolute link, right? So that means a resource that is not owned by us as developers. But you notice that there is a factor in this URI, which is embed, right? And this is essentially the link that you need to use in order to embed an external video file onto your page using the iframe tags. Remember, if you just simply go to YouTube and you just copy the YouTube videos link from the URL bar of your browser and then use that as a source file, it will not be able to figure out how to display that image. So this is a very important factor that you need to remember, that there is a unique link that is generated when you are trying to embed that using iframes, right? The same goes for any kind of, for website, it works differently. Website goes through, but for video files, you need the link, which is about embedding, okay? And not like a plain old link. Title is essentially something that if you kind of look at this, it will show you what the title is. The frame border is basically the border around this iframe. So if you keep on increasing the value of this and stuff like that, then you can see that it reloaded, but you can notice here that there is this very thin line that is kind of encapsulating the video that has been embedded, right? So if you want to keep it without border, you will essentially keep the frame border attribute as 0. And then allow full screen just gives you that full screen control that is available, that is going to be shown here, right? So it can go into the full screen mode, okay? And then here are some other optional attributes that are kind of self-explanatory. It allows for autoplay, encryption is there, and then there are some sensor options that are there as well, and that is essentially used if you are embedding this video on a device, a mobile device, which essentially has access to these different sensors that are present in every smartphone. And essentially what this allows us to do, can somebody think of the reason why you have the accelerometer and the gyroscope option present? Any idea? So if you're opening this video on your cell phone, right, your smartphone, your iPad and stuff like that, if you rotate the device, right, these sensors, which are accelerometer and gyroscope, they are able to sense that rotation that is happening, right? And if you have the portrait and the landscape mode unlocked, so essentially the rotation results in the screen to rotate as well, right? So this code, when you embed this in a mobile system's UI, right, instead of a web page, okay, then using these two parameters, which are basically allowed, allows the video to also kind of behave based on the way you rotate your device and stuff like that, right? So that is essentially the purpose of these two. The picture-in-picture mode, what it allows us to achieve is basically if you minimize the web page or if you go to a different web page, then you will have a smaller window allowing this to essentially continue playing, right? So if you remove any of these, remember these are Boolean type attributes, so you don't have to specify the value itself. As long as you specify the name of the attribute, it indicates the fact that it is present, right? That the value is true. And if it's not there, then the value is false, okay? So this is something that you should keep in mind. So here we can say section, let's give it a class, call it multimedia. Let's give it an ID, HTML iframe tag, something like this. Okay, so these are the three different ways where you can embed other multimedia files other than images in this on your website, right? So you can do your own audio file, you can do your own video file, as well as you can embed audio and video files coming from other sources, right? The only thing that you have to keep in mind is that the link that you use in order to do that embedding using the iframe tag of HTML must have the embed factor in that, right? Otherwise, it will give you a broken embedding, okay? For regular websites, let's say you just wanted to show a website, a different website, let's say oakland.edu on this page itself, then you don't need the embed factor in your URI, right? But for multimedia, you need the embed factor. So as a self-exercise, you can try replacing this with, let's say, the website for oakland.edu. So essentially, I can browse OU's homepage through these iframe embedding itself. So try that out and see if that works out for you or not, okay? So we were in the projects page. Essentially, we should have gone to the hobbies page, but that's okay. So let's come to the hobbies page now. Okay, so these are basically three different types of multimedia embedding that you can do on your page. Okay, so the next one that I wanted to show you, let's move this around a little bit because I did not want to put this here. So where is my main section? Okay, so this is my main section, and this goes till this point. So let me cut this and move this to my hobbies page. So right here, right, and save the projects page. Just that we wanted to use the projects page for just a table, right? So here in the projects page, what we want to do essentially is the main content is going to be a HTML table. So it is also one of the important HTML elements that you use from time to time. And it has some nuances that you need to be familiar with in order to represent that. One thing to note when working with HTML tables is the fact that you should never use table for presentation on your web page, right? Everything that has to do with structuring is what HTML is all about, or HTML5 is all about. So as a result of this, if you have some contents to display in a tabular fashion, then and only then should you use HTML table, right? You should not use HTML table in order to control the presentation or the layout of different HTML elements on your web page, right? So what I mean by that when I say this is, let's say you are on the home page and you want this to be centered, and then you have some other icons to the left of this and to the right of this, right? So it may come to you intuitively that, hey, if I create an HTML table, which has, let's say, 3 columns that is divided across this page, then for the middle column, I can put my H1 tag. For the rightmost column, I can put whatever content is to the right, and then same for the leftmost column. So that will have a distributed layout for the 3 contents that I have to my choosing, right? But you should not do that, because this is a CSS aspect. So essentially there is a clean line of distribution of the responsibilities that HTML5 has and CSS3 has, right? And this aspect of controlling the positioning and layout of different elements on your web page is a responsibility of CSS. And there are ways called CSS grids, which mimics the behavior of a table, right? That can be used to control the positioning and the layout. So we don't want to use ever HTML tables just for the purpose of controlling where different HTML elements lie on the web page, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind. So HTML table, and what we want to do here is basically a project table. So that means let's sketch out our table first real quick so we understand what we are trying to do. So here, I will have a projects table. So it will have something like a serial number, let's say, and then it will have a description of what the project was about, maybe a title. Let's put a title first, title of the project. And then we will have a start date. And then we will have an end date. And then at the end, maybe we can give a little bit of description. All right. So this will allow us to do the very basic table here, right? So we won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but let's start with the fundamentals of the table. So 2 things to remember, or 3 things actually. The environment for the HTML table is with the table tag. Okay, so you have an opening and then you have a closing table tag. Within a table tag, each row is created by using the tag tr. So tr is a table row. So it has an opening and it has a closing, right? So all the rows will be inside your table environment. And within each row, that is within each table row, the tables are denoted by their individual cells. So there is no concept of columns per se. So the idea here is there are only rows and each row has multiple data cells, right? So data cells are represented by the HTML tag TD, or which stands for table data. So it will have an opening and it will have a closing tag. Okay. So here, whenever you have multiple columns, you first have to figure out that how many cells do you have on the first row. So based on our initial sketch here, for every row, the number of data cells or table data that will be present is basically 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? How many rows you create, that is up to you. But we know that the first row, which is basically the heading row, is going to have 5. And as a result of that, to have uniformity for the rest of the table, you will also have 5 data cells each. Okay. So let's set that up. Let's implement this. Okay. So as we discussed, the primary environment is basically the table tag. And remember, you can give it an ID. And let's say this is the projects table. All right. And then there is another attribute, which is known as border. So remember when we were just working with our iframes tag, we saw there is an attribute that is called frame border. If it's 0, then the border is basically transparent. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you keep increasing the value, the thickness of the border keeps on increasing. So we have that same behavior here as well. So if you give a border of 1, that is the most thin line that you can have around your table, right? So let us put that border, and you can keep on increasing it, and we will see how that affects. So let's do the first thing. So the first thing is there will be the first header row, and we will revisit this header row real quick. So we're going to create one table row, and within this table row, we discussed the fact that there are 5 different table cells or table data. So we need to create 5 of this, right? So this is 1s, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. And what are the heading, or what are the values? So we have serial number for the first one. Okay. And then we have the title of the project. After that, we have the start date. And then we have the end date. And then we have the description, project description. All right. So let's look at our output real quick. What do we have? So in the projects table, so here we can see this is what we are working with, right? So let's put some data on this table, so it looks a little bit more decent than just that. So now for the next row, so here we will put some comments for us to keep a track of what we are doing. So this is basically the table header. Okay. And then the next comment will be basically first row of data. And I will paste the same thing again, but here I can start putting in the actual values. So let's say the title will be something like ABC research, something like this. And then start date, we can say, I don't know, 01 Jan 2023. And the end date is going to be, let's say, 30th of May 2023. And description, you can give some description, right? So here we can just say Lauren, something like this. Okay, so now you can see this. So just to show you what the border affects. So here, let us give a HR tag, so we can actually create a separation. Okay, so now if you increase the border, so let's say from 1, I raise it to around 5. Okay, so you can see that the table kind of gets this 3D look, basically, if you want to put it that way, and it pops out of the page more and more, right? So if you put a border value of 0, so essentially this will look like an empty table. So this is what we were discussing, that if you put the border to be 0, then essentially it will be a transparent table, and then you can use that for layout purposes, or people used to use that for layout purposes, but that should not be the case, right? So we will put, let's say, 2 here and keep this running. So let us just copy this thing again, and let's put another row, and we can say here second row of data. Okay. So let's just modify the serial number a little bit, and then change a few stuff. 3rd May, and then stuff like that. Okay, so this will continue to carry on. So now a question for you is from the perspective of a semantic tag, right? If you just pay attention to the table that we just developed here right now, right? If you just focus here, do you notice a problem that can create an issue with respect to the semantics? Remember the discussion that we had with semantics or HTML semantical tags is the fact that, is there a way, we always need to assess if there is a way to better represent the content on your website using meaningful HTML tags, right? So here, we know that we are dealing with 3 different tags right now. If we ignore the attributes for a second, we have the main environment for table, then we have the tag for table row, and then we have the tag which represents each cell in a table, which is table data. Okay, so do you see with this construction or this implementation here that there is a way to further improve the semantic aspect of your page? Any idea?
Should we mark that first row as like a heading instead of just another row?
Correct. So we notice here that the first row that we have here is actually, from a content perspective, different from every other row that is going to be present in the table, right? The reason behind it is because the first row is not the table data, but it's actually a table header, right? So that allows us to kind of use or get familiar with another HTML semantic tag, is that whenever you create the table header, instead of using the TR tag, which stands for table row, you use a different tag, which is more semantic in nature, and that is known as TH, which stands for table header. Now, this is not just going to be semantically more sound, but you will see that it kind of changes. I think I made a mistake here. What did I change? Is everything looks good here? 5, 6. Okay. So let's put this and we can deal with what did we do wrong. Okay. So instead of putting this here, what you want to do is you want to put all of this as a table header. Okay. So let's change all of this. Could have done this in one go, but anyways. Table header. So it will take some time, tedious task, but let's be patient and fix this. So now if we look at this, you can see that the browser itself understands and treats this particular row a little bit different compared to the others. And it has also given the bold font to the first row, because now you are identifying each of these data values, which is present in the first row, as table heading rather than table data as well. Okay, so you also have options to further divide this table into its own semantic elements, right? So by that, I mean there are also tags for table head. Okay, and then you can put whatever the header of the table is, just like we discussed about the fact that we can break down the body of your web page into header sections, main section, and then footer section. Similarly, for the table, you can create T head, okay, T body, and then T foot as well. So this way, what I can do is, let's say if this is the table header, right, I can take this, move it out, and then put it inside the table header section, okay? And then put this here. And then similarly, I know that I have a table body somewhere. So I can take my first row of data and second row of data, and then move this inside my table body. So this is basically just arranging the sections. And then in the footer, if I have another table row, okay, let's say that is just with respect to the final information that you have and stuff like this. So I can just put it 3 here and everything else can remain the same. You get the idea. And then you will not see any kind of visual changes to this, but what this allows you to do is basically structure your web page in a more meaningful fashion that conveys the information that, okay, whatever content is present inside this particular tag is basically the header of the table, okay? Whatever content is there in the body, that is the body of the table. If you do not have a footer, then you don't need to include it, but just for your know-how as to that you can do this, then this is something that we can do as well, okay? So the next thing that I want to show you for the table attribute is, what if you needed to merge 2 rows together, okay, and then have the next row. So for example, let's say you have just a single title, and then this research title have multiple start dates. Does that make sense? So the same research title have an option for, let's say, starting from a particular start date or an end date. Or another situation where you can have, let's say you're trying to display the names of a particular user and who their parents are, or who their emergency contact information are, right? So you can still have the serial number column, and then you can have the actual username. So you will have some value here. But let's say this username is associated with two parents, right? So you can have parent one and parent two. Okay. So, and then whatever information can be thereafter. So instead of, if you have to repeat this twice, right, then the serial number will create a problem because the serial number is associated with the user itself, but both of these parent names are associated to one user, right? So you cannot put this person into its own particular row per se. You need to have a way where one table data cell for this particular row and this particular column, sorry, not row, associates to two rows of this particular column. Okay, so essentially what we do is we use these attributes that are known as row span. If you're trying to create a situation like this where you're spanning a row across multiple rows, or if you're trying to merge, let's say, columns, then the option or the attribute that you use for that is basically column span, right? So let's take an example and try to implement this as well to understand how you can do row span. Okay, and you can try the column span by yourself as a self exercise. You just have to replace the implementation of the row span, understand the structure, and then just use column span. Okay, so here I will show you a demo for using row span attribute with HTML tables. All right, so let's start with a fresh table here. All right, and let's put a horizontal separation before we move forward from this. All right, so what we want to do is first, of course, create a table environment. I'm not giving any attributes, ID, and stuff like that. Maybe what I want to give is probably a border with value of, I don't know, let's put some 6 and stuff like that. Let's play around with it. Okay. And then in addition to that, you can give a caption here. I forgot to mention this. You can give the name of the table, and then you can say illustrate row span for HTML tables. All right. So if you do this, I don't know if it will show up right away, but you can see that there is no table here, but the figure caption shows here. So if we do the caption for this table, this will be a little bit more evident. Is you can create caption and say table projects table, something like this. So you can see here the caption will be shown on top of the table. So that is essentially what the captions attribute can do as well. All right. So now what we want to do is create the first row. So in order to do that, I will use the table row tag. And then within the table row, I will create a header. So remember, any header, you will use the th tag instead of the tr tag, right? And let's say we have the child name. All right, so I want to implement exactly this situation that we were talking about, where you have, let's say, username who's a child, and you have to relate the two parents' name with the child itself, right? So I will have a child name, and then I will have a what do you call parents' name. Okay. All right. So once you do this, this is the first row. The next thing is this thing needs to span across 2 rows. And what I mean by this thing is basically the next row's data cell for child's name, right? So this is where you will put the row span. So essentially what this implies to is that whichever data cell is going to span multiple rows, you use the row span attribute with the data tag there, and then you specify how many rows it is going to span across, right? So for example, here, we know in the next row, we will start with our data itself, right? So I will put another tr tag here, okay? And here, the first data cell, typically there should have been 2 data cells, right? So the first data cell would have been for the parent, and then you will have another data cell which will follow it up with the first parent's name. Okay, but we know the fact that this first data cell, which is this one here, is going to span across 2 rows. Okay, and then the next data cell is going to be present. All right, so what I'm going to do as a result of that is for this first data cell, which is the child's name. So here I will say child 1. Okay, and this is where I'm going to use the row span attribute, because I know this data cell is going to span across 2 different, and I'm going to say that it will span across 2 rows. So this part is done. Okay, so this is where child 1 name goes. And then I have also, using the row span attribute, specified that it is going to span across 2 rows. So in the next row, I'm not going to specify any value for this location here. This location here is going to be empty. I'm not going to specify any value here. Okay, and everything else will continue as it is. So the next data cell for the first row is essentially the first parent's name. So if we go back here, we see that we have created this tag, which is for the first parent's name. So I can say parent 1. All right, so this takes care of our first data row. And now we need to do the same thing for the next data row. Now notice here, as we discussed, since in the previous row, so this is row 1 and this is row 2, right? In the first row, for this data cell, we specified using the row span attribute that it's going to span across these 2 rows, right? So when I come to the second data row, I'm going to leave this data cell empty. That is, as far as implementation is concerned, I'm not going to specify anything here. I'm simply going to move on to this particular parent's name, right? So what I'm going to do here then is just specify a single data cell instead of 2 data cells that I typically would have done if I didn't have a spanning row. So I will just say TD and then parent 2. Okay. So essentially, if we have our logic correct, then this should show us, so this is how it is going to show us, right? So when you're using column span, please remember that a single column can span across multiple rows, right? So that is something that you have to try out and see if you can do that as well, right? So all you have to remember is the location. First, sketch out what it traditionally will look like, then divide it out on your sketch, find out the data cell location which is going to span, use row span if it is spanning rows, use call span if it is spanning across multiple data cells, okay? And then specify how many cells it will span, write your data, and then in the consecutive cells, you will just abstract or not specify the data for the previous cell, right? So here again, to repeat, I noticed this is what my traditional sketch is going to look like. Let's do a fresh diagram here so that everybody gets an idea. So typically, if I would have a traditional table, then I would have had 2 rows here. This is the serial number, this is the child's name, and then this is the parent's name. Okay, so this is a typical scenario. I know that when I have a child's name, this will be associated to 2 parents' name, right? So I know at this location is where my spanning will start. So for this data cell, I use the row span attribute and I tell the browser when it renders that this data cell is going to span across 2 rows, right? So this is where I embed the row span attribute. I continue writing my next data cell for row 1. When I come to row 2, since I've already specified that the previous data cell for this location is going to span, so this is something that I will essentially ignore, okay? And then I will just specify the value of a single data cell. If you had a data cell before this, you would have done it, but instead of 3 data cells, this row now would have 2 data cells, okay? And the browser will be able to figure out what to do with it based on HTML, right? So that is how you can span your tables or rows across multiple rows, okay? Any question here? All good?
All good.
Okay. All right. So where are we? So we did the multimedia files, the audio and video. We did the tables as well. So let me show you a small thing before we proceed to HTML forms and contact. So in the index page, sometimes if you visit, so let's say if you look at this particular website here, you would notice that there is this small icon on the tab, right? So also if you visit to, let's say, oakland.edu, so you see there is this OU symbol or this OU icon that is kind of present in the title bar here. This icon has a word for it, and it is called a favicon, right? So it's called a favorite icon or favicon, right? Typically, it is suggested for you to use .png files, which are of high resolution, not that high resolution, but that you can embed that there when you are using that, when you're trying to use a favicon icon, right? So the way you need to do it, or the location where you embed this favicon, first of all, can somebody tell me where would this be placed? So if I'm trying to embed this image here, where should I specify the HTML tag that can allow us to do so? It's not going to be an image tag. We will see what tag essentially is being used. But can somebody tell me where I should place it in my HTML file? So this is the index page. Where should I place it in this whole file that I currently have to show an icon image like this at the top? Any suggestions? No?
Should it go in the head of the document instead of the body?
Correct. Absolutely right. Right? Because remember, where do we get this information? This is basically the title of the web page. So you can see here in the index page, the title is a part of the head HTML tag, right? So any kind of information that is about the metadata of the page, and of course, let's suppose the title, is going to be present in the head portion, all right? And the way you do it is you link the image to your website. You don't embed an image file, you link the image. So in order to link any kind of external stuff to your page, you use the HTML tag link. And you can see here from the suggestions that VS Code is showing me, there are many different options of link, right? So you can put an RSS feed, you can put CSS files, and we're going to learn how to embed CSS file. You can import different content distribution networks, different like script files, and then links like Google fonts and stuff like that onto your stuff. And these are some of the options that are there. So we're not doing CSS. What we are doing here is basically the favorite icon or favicon, right? So if you click on that, then it will essentially tell you what this is. So here you can say shortcut icon, or you can simply say just an icon. Now this is the href. Now the href has to be somewhere, right? And that somewhere is typically going to be inside your images folder, all right? So let's go ahead and let me just find an image for my favicon here. So let me say Mickey Mouse fav icon. Okay, so we have some stuff going on here. Not sure if I can use this, but let me give it a try. Save image as. And then this is in desktop. I think this is CSI3150-HTML, and in images, I can just say this. Okay, so I have saved this image here. It will not show up, but it's a PNG image. So what I want to do is, this is the index file. So that means in the root directory, I will go to images and I will simply just use download.png. Okay, so if I save this and come back to this and go back to my home page, you can now see that there is this favicon icon or favorite icon that I just downloaded. So remember here, just for this image here, it is not about using the image tag that we just learned about for embedding images onto our pages. It's about using the link tag, which helps us link different resources to our website, okay, as a part of the metadata. But notice the fact that if you go to the other pages, you're losing that image. because you all know why. Because I have to now take this link file that I just created, and I need to visit all of these different pages one by one, unfortunately, and then paste it. Okay, life will become much easier when we just move into React and learn that. So I think I missed 1 or 2 pages. So for the resume, put it here. And I think that takes care of most of them, hopefully, right? If not, you guys can do some of them. Okay. All right. So some of them are working, others are not. So we can fix that, but essentially we will know what to do. All right. So the next thing that I want to talk about is essentially how to do HTML forms. Okay. It is kind of an important know-how to understand the HTML elements that can essentially help us allow users to interact, implement features that allows users to interact with your website. Okay. This essentially will become the foundation when you also use JavaScript and create interactive web pages as well, right? And not just static web pages. We want to create dynamic and interactive web pages, right? So taking input is not the same as HTML forms, right? So let's start off with the fact that what are the different options that is available when you're working with forms, right? So let's start with the basic concepts. When you want to, the basic notion is that when you want to submit data, okay, from the user interface and then push it to, let's say, some sort of server, then the typical environment that you use in order to implement this on the UI side of it are known as HTML forms. Okay. HTML form is basically an environment, just like we had the table environment. And then within the table environment, we had things like table row, table data, or table header for just the data cells of the first row and stuff like that. Within HTML forms, there are also 2 types of additional HTML elements, which are meaningless in nature because they don't help us achieve any kind of meaning. You cannot translate that. That allows you to create these forms, right? That allows the user to enter the information that is required. And then later on, using JavaScript, you kind of grab those information, package them into a data packet, and then send it as an HTTP request back to your server, right? So what we are going to learn essentially through this course is how to use these elements, and of course, and how to grab the data that the users might enter on your platform using JavaScript, and then store them locally on the browser itself and do some processing on it. So that later, essentially, that will be the endpoint, which will be connected to the server side if you're trying to connect your form to the server, right? So what is essential is for you to remember that if you're not submitting the data, if you're doing some kind of local processing, you just want to say things like, it's kind of a little bit simplistic, but think of it this way. It's like your website says, hello, what is your name? And then you have a text field for the user to enter their name. And then the user enters the name, and then you give them a prompt back that, hello, ABC, welcome to my website, and stuff like that. So that's also some level of fundamental interaction, but that does not need a form per se. You see what I'm saying? Essentially, you want to use a form when you're trying to submit something to the server, right? And this form has different supporting elements, right? So buttons can be of 3 different types. You have a default button, okay, which doesn't do anything. You can name the button whatever you want, and then you can write your own logic or script associated with that button, and then the button will behave that same way. But then there is a specific button for submitting data to the server, right? And that is known as a submit button. And then there is also a button that you can create that is basically a reset button, which if you click, will reset all of the previous form fields that is present in your HTML form. Input can be of many different types, right? So for example, you can have a simple text input. You can have an input which is specifically for a password, right? You can have an input which is specifically for email. So this is essentially used for login purposes if you're creating forms like this. You can have different kinds of input for radio buttons. You can have input for checklist. Sometimes you can also call it as checkboxes, whatever you want to call it. And there are many more, right? You can have an input for file upload as well. You can have an input for date. Okay, so it will open up a calendar and then it will show the date and the users can select the date and stuff like that. So these are some of the many possibilities that allows users to interact with your website. And this is the foundation. Without JavaScript, this won't essentially work, right? You can still enter the data, but you cannot grab the data and do processing on it, right? You need JavaScript for that. So in our contact us page, let us try to create some of these, or let us try to implement some of these HTML elements that we just talked about and see how it works out, right? So again, remember, when we are using form, okay, we need to remember that it is for the purpose of sending data to the server in like 8 out of 10 cases, right? So where I want to do this is basically the contact me page. So this is the end of the header. So here I will just create the main body. Of the page, right? So here I'll just use the main tag, or I can use a div if it has no meaning. All right. So here I want to use form. So you see, the moment I write form, okay, so there are 3 different options that VS Code is giving from the Emmet support, right? You have a regular form, so it's not going to do anything. But if you notice that the second 2 options that we have on the screen is a get, and then the other one is a post, okay? So essentially what get is representing is a read request from the server. So that means the form is going to send user data, which the server will process and then respond back with whatever data the user is requesting, right? So that is basically the RESTful API method get request. It's basically a read request to your server. And then on the contrary, if you have a post request, so that means you are essentially writing to the database, right? You're essentially telling the server to take the information that the client is providing and then create that entry in the database. That would be some of the most simplest scenarios for get and post, right? So here we don't have a get, we don't have a post. So for now, maybe we can do like a post request because, you know, the purpose of the form that we are creating here is a user is trying to contact you. So you want to record that information in your database, right? So there will be some username, some email ID that you can contact them back with, some message they want to send you and stuff like that, right? In the actions, so there are 2 important attributes of a form. So the method that we just talked about, that is whether the UI or the client is sending a write request or a read request, okay? Post, remember, is a write request. So that means you're telling the server to create some kind of data entry and stuff like that. And then get is basically a read request. So let me put this down here for everybody to remember here. So there are 4 different REST API methods, okay? And these 4 are get, which basically means a read request from the server. Then you have put, sorry, not put, but let's do post first, which is basically a write request, okay? Or basically we can say create entry, okay? And here we can say read entry from the server, okay? And then let's say we have 2 more. So the third one is essentially a put request with an ID. And this requires, and this is basically an update entry. And then finally, the last one that we have is basically a delete method, which also requires an ID. Otherwise, it will delete everything. Some database will not allow you to operate without the ID itself. And this is basically to delete the entry. Right? And this kind of equates to the basic 4 functionalities that should be supported by any full stack web system or mobile system. That is to be able to create data, read data, update data, and then delete data. So the acronym for that is basically CRUD. Okay. So here forms essentially help to do one of these 4 operations. You can do post, get, put, or delete. All right. Sometimes you will see in some websites or in some tutorials, instead of using put, they use the patch, right? So there's an alternative to this, which is essentially patch. Okay, so you can use that as well. So now within this form, the other field, the other attribute is the action attribute. So the action attribute is basically the URL of your server endpoint. Right? So essentially, your server will have different functionalities or modules that is going to handle different types of requests, right? And that will be recognized with the help of a URL. So basically, when this form and post method is activated, it will go looking for this URL, figure out what kind of operation is being requested, and then take whatever data is here and then send it to the server. And then the server can unpack the data on its side and then see what is going on, right? So here, essentially, you will give whatever URL is going to handle whatever this form data is. Okay, so let's start with the basic stuff. We need names, right? So we need an input field. Okay, and the input field's type. So here, remember, we just talked about that there are many different types of input, right? You can have text, password, email, etc., right? So for any kind of input tag, you need to specify what its type is going to be, right? So here, the type is going to be specifically text, because people are going to be writing the text, all right? And then we need to give it an ID. So we can say that this is basically my first name. And then we also need to give it a name itself that can be used to refer to this particular field, right? So this name in particular will be something that will be used by the server when it unpacks the data. So when it unpacks the data, it's going to use this name here, okay? And the ID is for the UI side to kind of identify this particular element here, all right? So here I will use the same name as I did in the ID, just to make sure that I don't have to keep a track of multiple stuff. And this is a self-closing tag. Okay, there is nothing going on. But if you do this, right, you will notice something here. Let me show you what we got here. You see, we just have this text field here, and now you can type and do things like this, but it's missing something in terms of presentability, is that the user doesn't know what this empty field is all about. It does not talk about what is going on and stuff like that. So what is missing from here is another HTML tag which identifies what this input is. Remember, since it is a self-closing tag, there is no way for you to specify what these input fields are about. So in order to give the user an idea about what these tags or input fields are about, you need to label them. That's essentially what we call, right? Whether you put the label before the tag itself or after the tag determines its position on the web page. So here, before this, I want to have a label like first name, right? So here I need to use the label tag, okay? And you see, when you have this for attribute, then it's asking which input element are you referring, right? So essentially, you have to put the name, and you basically need to say this. And then within the label, you need to specify whatever you want to show on the browser side, right? So you will say enter first name, something like this. So now if you see this, you have this enter first name. Let's put some separation again here. Okay, so now once we understand this, we can create the other stuff as well. So after this, I need to give like a break. Okay, because remember, these input and buttons are also inline tags in nature. So as a result of that, if I do not explicitly put a new line, then whatever I put after this content is going to show up in the same line. So let's take this opportunity to kind of understand the implications of inline tag again. So I will copy this. And after this, I'll put this here, but this won't be first name. This will essentially be last name. Okay, so L name, and here I can say enter last name. And here I can give the ID as L name. And similarly, instead of doing this here, I'll just give L name, right? So if I do this here, you can see that both of these elements, that all of these elements, even label is in line, is going to come one after the other. So since this is not a block tag, if we want to put a line break, all right, or a new line between wherever we want to put it in the inline tag, we essentially need to have a break. Later on, CSS will fix this. We don't have to use these breaks anymore. All right. So this will what will be shown as if you put the break. So you can put another break to kind of make it look a little bit more spacious. All right. So this will allow you to essentially enter whatever text you want. So here, if you have things like this, if you change from this text type to password, all right. So if you do this, then if you enter something here, you can see that the style kind of changes, right? It kind of mimics the behavior of password, that it's not going to show you the password. So anytime you do the login page, right, you will not want to use the type text for something that is password and stuff like that. So if you go here, if you click control space, it is essentially going to show you all of the different options that you can do here, right? So for example, you can do date time here. You can have email. File will allow you to kind of upload the file. If you do hidden, then it's not going to be shown on the page. Okay, it will be, if you want to upload an image, just select a month or a number, and these are all of the different options that you can essentially use here. So here you can see, do the date time, right, or just the date time and stuff like that. If I click on the box, then you can see a lot of these pages have these different options where it pops open the calendar and allows you to insert the date and stuff like that. So you can keep a reference sheet that allows you to essentially, you know, plug in all of the different values or all of the different types of input that you're trying to put there. So let's just put this here. And let's do a few more. Let's do something like a radio button somewhere, right? So when you're working with radio buttons, the only thing that you have to remember is that there is another additional attribute that comes into the picture. Okay, so let us put two breaks here. All right, and then we will say radio buttons. All right, so when you do radio buttons, you of course will have the same input here. Let me just see if we had the support for no, it's gone anyways. So we have to give the type here, of course. All right. So input, okay. So here it does not say radio button. Okay, radio. All right. So what is important here is another attribute, which is basically value. Okay, and the value is something that will be collected when you select that particular radio button. So what I mean by that is, of course, the type is going to change to radio, just as we learned that you can change from text to password to date and all those things. So this will change to radio. All right. Here you will give it a name such that the server can identify what you're working with. So let's say you have something like this. So let me put a p tag and then what is your favorite programming language? Okay, you have something like this, and then you have your options here. Of course, there is an option tag, but we're not using that right now. So here you have to give it a name, right? So let's say I do Python first, and my ID is also going to remain as Python, okay? And then probably my value is going to be Python. Okay, so when I select one of these radio buttons, then this is the value that will be grabbed from it, not the name, but the value itself. Okay, so you can have a different value depending on the type of processing that you want to do, right? And then here for the name itself, right, we can change this a little bit. Instead of giving separate names, we need to make sure that the user cannot select more than one radio button. That's the difference between checklist and radio buttons, is that checklist, you can have multiple check marks, but radio button, the whole idea of the implementation is to make sure that you are using, or the users are able to select only one option, right? So here you will just say programming language, okay? And I want to keep this similar with all the rest. So let's see. So we have the ID as Python, value as Python, the name will remain the same so that the user can only select one of them. And that's it. So what I want to do is now save this, copy this, and let's say paste it 2 more times. And here for the last one, I can probably do Java and give the ID as Java as well. And then for the second one, I can do, let's say, JavaScript, and then give a value of JavaScript as well, right? So now if we check what we are working with, then we see the same problem here, that only the field is being displayed to us. We are essentially missing the labels, right? So now, as we discussed, if you put this before, so here when we were working, we put the label before the input text field. And as a result of that, this label comes first, and then you see the text field. If you do the same thing here, that is not going to kind of render the radio buttons the way we are used to, right? So we have to do a little bit of change here. Instead of using the label for before that, right, we need to use the label earlier, okay, after this. So where is it? Where are my buttons? Here. Okay, so here I need to put a label. Okay, and the label is basically going to be for Python. And here I will simply just say Python. And then I will copy this, go after this, put it here, and this is going to be JavaScript. All right, and then we need to change this to the ID that it is using so that we can refer to it. So here we have the ID. And then finally, after this, we have not JavaScript, but label for Java. And then we need to essentially display Java. All right, so now if you do this, you can see that you are capable of displaying radio options here, that is single option, correct option. So a few things to note here, since these are inline tags, if you want them to be displayed one after the other, you have to use CSS, okay? Make them a block tag, or since we have not learned CSS at this point of time, we need to put these break statements between them. All right. The other thing that you need to note here is sometimes as a new beginner, we face this problem that users are able to select all the radio buttons at the same time, right? But the purpose of the radio button is to ensure that the user can only select one option. If they're allowed to select multiple options, then essentially they will use checklist, or as a developer, you will use checklist. The way we are achieving this, that is the user cannot select more than one option, is notice here for the name of this element is the same throughout. As a result of that, this is kind of specifying that you can only select one value with this particular name. So the name is prohibiting, the same name for all of these different options is prohibiting the user from being able to select multiple options at the same time. However, since we have specified using this new attribute called value here, different values, depending on which option was finally selected at the time when this form is being submitted, the server will receive the appropriate value. Okay, so this is basically how, this is one important problem that sometimes people face. So this is how you essentially solve it. If I, at any point of time, let's take this guy here and change this to programming language 1. If I change this, then you will notice here that I can only select Java, JavaScript, and Python. So I can do multiple options here because right now I have changed the name. So remember this attribute name, if you keep it same across all your options, then the user can only select one option. And how do you know whether the values are changing depending on the option, since the name is the same? Then you use the value attribute. When you're going to do the same thing for checkboxes. So let me show you one simple example of a checkbox. So here I will show a checkbox tutorial. Right? So if I do an input tag and I go for a checkbox, okay, so the name, so I had programming language 1, okay, and then I can give Python, all right, and then I can give it a value. I must give it a value, and I call it Python in itself, all right. I save this, copy this, and do it for the Java stuff as well. So I will change the value to Java. I'll change the ID to Java, but I will also change this as well. So now if you go back here, you see there are 2 checkboxes. You can check mark both of them. Okay. And when the server collects this value, you can either choose to collect the value itself, or if it is check marked or not, whether it is true or false, right? So the only thing that you have to change here is you have to give it probably a different ID. So I will just say Python -checkbox and then Java -checkbox. Okay. Otherwise, when you try to label them, then you can essentially fall into a problem of having non-unique IDs. Okay. So I will leave this as a self-exercise for you guys to just try and label this out and put it one after the other. And then the last aspect is basically a submit button. Okay. That needs to be present, and that marks the end of the form. All right. So here we will have a submit button that ends the form. Okay. So you can again go for input, and then you can go for a type button, but here you can change the type of the button to submit. Remember, we talked about the fact that there are 3 different types of buttons that you can create through the input factor. There's a default, so the type would be button itself. Then there is a submit button, and then there is also a button for reset, right? So if you do this, then you can have the type submit, and then the value that will be submit itself. All right. So now if you do this, and if you go back to our page, then you can see that here is a submit button. If you had just left this as a default button, then it would have just showed us the value that you're saying. So if you submit this, then this submit button is directly connected to this form action and method in a full stack environment. So when you click on the submit button, it will take all of the information that the user has provided, either through the text fields or through the multiple options, and then it will send it to the URL that has been specified in this action. That will be some sort of server, and it will tell the server what to do with the data. That is what the client is requesting to do with the data as well. Okay. So that essentially allows you to create interactive fields. So as a self-exercise, what I want you to do is take this text field and the other type of inputs that we learned about, and then create a well-structured contact me page that you can put here, right? And then the users can provide. So you can ask the users to give their first name, last name, their email. If you want, if you're doing something like a newsletter sign up or something like this, you can ask for a date of birth just to practice all of the other stuff. You can do a file upload input section, a short, or not a short, but a long text description of what their message is, and then a submit button and a few options for radio, and then checklist. Okay. So please try it out. This is an important thing, otherwise you might forget. So today, the important stuff that we learned is, first of all, how to embed multimedia files, how to embed files, videos, essentially, that are external to your website as an embedded element on your web page using the iframes tag. All right. Then we also learned about the HTML table environments and some of the semantic aspects of HTML table. Okay. How to do row span, and please try out the column span as well by yourself. And then finally, we started our discussion on HTML forms, which is one of the fundamental ways in which from the UI, you can either send data or request data back from the server. And every form element has many different options on how users can interact with your page, provide input and stuff like that. So we learned about the input for text, about date, email, how you can do that. We looked into radio buttons and how you can create labels for them, checkboxes, okay, and then the submit button. Remember, when you click the submit button here, you can see that this URL server endpoint is where it is pointing to. So we said that the moment you hit a submit button, it is going to take you back, or this form action and method will be fired up, right? It will be executed. So we can see here, this is exactly what it is trying to do. So it's taking it from pages, URL server endpoint. Since I'm on my local host, it's trying to find whatever this endpoint is there, right? So, but this will take you to the server when you're working with an actual server. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the more attributes that we can use for these different stuff. So for example, in the text field, for the input type field, right? So there is this additional attribute that is known as a placeholder. So for example, you can say something like John Doe or things like that. So that will show you some idea, that will give the user some idea that how to, or what kind of text is being expected and things like that. So for text fields, you can use this placeholder text that essentially shows you those options that you see in some websites as to what to write or what kind of data you're expecting and stuff like that. So that is another attribute that you can use for making your presentation a little bit more meaningful, right? And stuff like that. So I'll wrap up here. And in the next class, we will cover whatever remaining more frequently used HTML tags. There are some small quirky tags that are there in the semantic tag section. For example, how to put your address, how to put a quote, how to create this. There are situations where you can specify spoiler information, but it's hidden. So if the user actually wants to see the spoiler, they click on that spoiler button and then it shows you the information. So there is a way to implement that as well. Okay. Not the styling, but the structure of it. So we will talk about those remaining stuff and then wrap up HTML next class in person, okay, which is going to be the coming Thursday, 10 in the morning in MSc 167. Okay. So I'll see you all then at that time. All right. Bye-bye.